Right now, as you are watching this, somewhere in the world, a nuclear weapon exists that was never fully recovered. It is sitting on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, or buried under the permafrost ice of Greenland, or corroding quietly in the dark Atlantic depths. It got there because of a program so extraordinary, so audacious, so genuinely terrifying in its ambition, that most people today have never heard of it. A program in which the United States Air Force kept nuclear-armed bombers in the air, continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, for years on end. Bombers loaded with hydrogen bombs, each one 100 times more powerful than the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima, flying routes that took them to the edges of Soviet airspace, engines running, bomb bay doors ready, crews sitting at their stations waiting for the order that would end civilization as we know it. The sign at the entrance to Strategic Air Command headquarters read, "Peace is our profession," and they meant every word of it. This is the story of SAC, of Curtis LeMay, of Chrome Dome, and of how close we came, not once, but many times, to accidentally starting the nuclear war that every one of those bombers existed to prevent. To understand the Strategic Air Command, you first have to understand the world that created it. The year is 1945. The Second World War has just ended. America has used atomic bombs on Japan, and the shock of that event has fundamentally changed the nature of warfare forever. Before Hiroshima, war was a contest of armies and navies and air forces, of logistics and manpower and industrial production. After Hiroshima, war became something else entirely. It became a contest of who could deliver the most destructive single weapon to the most critical point in the least amount of time. And in 1946, the United States Air Force created the Strategic Air Command specifically to be the instrument of that new kind of warfare. SAC's mission was brutally simple. In the event of war with the Soviet Union, SAC would deliver nuclear weapons to targets inside the USSR, destroy the Soviet state, and end the war in a matter of days. That was the plan. That was the entire doctrine. It was called massive retaliation. And for the first years of SAC's existence, it was largely theoretical because the bombs and the aircraft and the training necessary to actually execute it were nowhere near adequate. And that is where Curtis LeMay enters the story. Curtis Emerson LeMay was born on November 15, 1906, in Columbus, Ohio. He was not a charming man. He was not a diplomatic man. He was not a man who went in much for pleasantries or small talk or institutional politics. He was a man who believed, with absolute iron conviction, that there was a right way and a wrong way to do everything, and that the right way involved maximum preparation, maximum discipline, maximum training, and maximum willingness to use overwhelming force. In the Second World War, LeMay had demonstrated these qualities with brutal effectiveness. As a young bomber officer in Europe, he had personally led missions over Germany when it was considered suicidal to do so. He had developed new formation tactics that reduced losses and improved bombing accuracy. He had earned the respect and the fear of everyone who served under him. By 1944, LeMay had been promoted to Major General and given command of the B-29 Super Fortress bombing campaign against Japan. The early results were disappointing. High-altitude precision bombing from 30,000 feet was failing because the jet stream over Japan blew the bombs off target. LeMay made a decision that still generates historical controversy today. He ordered his B-29s to strip out their guns, load up with incendiary bombs instead, and fly at low altitude over Japanese cities at night. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, over 300 B-29s executed LeMay's plan against Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed more than 100,000 people in a single night. It was the single most destructive conventional bombing raid in the history of warfare. And LeMay followed it up. Night after night, city after city. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya. 63 Japanese cities burned. Hundreds of thousands of civilians killed. LeMay's response to this was exactly what you would expect from a man like Curtis LeMay. He essentially remade SAC from the ground up. He dissolved underperforming units. He reassigned weak officers to administrative roles where they could not damage the mission. He transferred the best pilots and crews to the nuclear strike groups where they were most needed. He instituted an unrelenting program of training exercises, simulated missions, readiness inspections, and performance evaluations. Crews that could not meet his standards were gone. Crews that could meet his standards were pushed harder to exceed them. He ordered a 96-hour nonstop around-the-world flight to prove aerial refueling capability. He built new family housing at Offutt because he understood that the families of his airmen needed stability and security if those airmen were going to give everything they had to the mission. He was brutal, demanding, exhausting to work for, and genuinely respected by the men who served under him because they could see that he was building something real. By the early 1950s, LeMay had supplemented the aging B-36 bomber force with the new B-47 Stratojet, the first swept-wing strategic jet bomber in the world. The B-47 was a stunning aircraft, fast and capable, but demanding to fly. And LeMay was already thinking about what came next. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, which made its first flight in April 1952, was the aircraft that would define SAC for the next generation. 8 jet engines under swept wings, a range of thousands of miles, a bomb capacity that could carry multiple thermonuclear weapons. The B-52 was not merely an airplane. It was a statement. It told the Soviet Union, in terms that could not be misunderstood, we can reach you. Anywhere. Anytime. And we can destroy you utterly. Under LeMay's command, SAC went from that empty, hollow embarrassment of 1948 to a force of 224,000 airmen, nearly 2,000 heavy bombers, and over 800 tanker aircraft. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin reportedly told his advisors that he had nothing to counter what LeMay was building. Nothing. One of the most powerful military minds in the Soviet Union simply looked at SAC and recognized that he could not match it. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because the entire doctrine of massive retaliation, the entire theory that underlay SAC's existence, depended on a very specific assumption, that if the Soviets knew America could destroy them, they would never start a war. The bomb itself was the deterrent. The threat of annihilation was what kept the peace. This was what SAC's motto, "Peace is our profession," actually meant. Not that these men were pacifists. Not that they were against war. It meant that by being so absolutely, comprehensively, terrifyingly ready for war, they were ensuring that war would never come. The peace was guaranteed by the readiness to end it. It was a logic that was perfectly coherent and also deeply, profoundly, continuously dangerous. Because deterrence only works as long as both sides believe it. And deterrence only works as long as nothing goes wrong. The first major challenge to SAC's deterrence doctrine came on August 29, 1949, when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. America's nuclear monopoly, which had lasted only 4 years, was over. The world now had 2 nuclear powers. And the strategic calculations that had seemed so clean and simple in 1945 suddenly became vastly more complex. Now the Soviets could threaten America's cities too. Now the question was not just whether America could destroy the Soviet Union, but whether America could survive the counterstrike if a nuclear war actually started. And then, on October 4, 1957, the world changed again. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. Most Americans focused on the propaganda victory, the fact that the Soviets had beaten America into space. But the military implications were far more alarming than any propaganda. Sputnik meant the Soviets had a rocket powerful enough to loft a satellite into orbit. And a rocket powerful enough to loft a satellite into orbit was also powerful enough to deliver a nuclear warhead from the Soviet Union to an American city. The age of intercontinental ballistic missiles had arrived, and that changed everything. Because the fundamental problem with ICBMs was time. A Soviet bomber flying toward the United States from Soviet bases would take hours to arrive. That was enough time to detect it, to scramble interceptors, to put SAC's bombers in the air before they could be destroyed on the ground. But an ICBM launched from the Soviet Union would arrive in roughly 30 minutes. 30 minutes from launch to impact. That was barely enough time to detect the launch, confirm it, get word to the president, and authorize a response. 4 SAC's bombers sitting on the ground. 30 minutes might not be enough time to get them airborne before Soviet warheads arrived and destroyed the bases entirely. And if SAC's bombers were destroyed on the ground, America had no nuclear strike capability left. And if America had no nuclear strike capability, the deterrent was gone. And if the deterrent was gone, the peace was gone too. LeMay understood this with absolute clarity. He had been pushing for SAC readiness since 1948, and now the technological situation was making that readiness even more urgent and even more precarious. His response was to begin reducing the ground-based alert time, pushing his crews to be able to launch their aircraft within 15 minutes of receiving the order. But 15 minutes was still cutting it dangerously close against ICBM warning times. And so, in the late 1950s, SAC began experimenting with something far more radical. What if the bombers were not on the ground at all? What if, instead of scrambling to get airborne after detecting a Soviet launch, some portion of SAC's strike force was already airborne, continuously, at all times, already in the air, and already heading toward their launch points near Soviet airspace? What if you made SAC's bombers literally impossible to destroy in a first strike by simply never having them on the ground in the first place? This was the concept that would eventually become Operation Chrome Dome. The idea was both brilliant and insane in roughly equal measure. Keep a fraction of SAC's B-52 force in the air continuously, 24 hours a day, armed with thermonuclear weapons, flying predetermined routes that kept them within striking distance of Soviet targets. If the Soviets launched a surprise attack and destroyed every single SAC air base on the ground, the airborne bombers would still be there, still flying, still armed, still able to execute their strike missions. The deterrent would survive. The counterstrike would still come. And knowing this, the Soviets would never launch their first strike in the first place. That was the theory. Clean, logical, coherent. And it required flying nuclear-armed B-52s over the Arctic, over the Atlantic, over the Mediterranean, over Canada, over Greenland, over Spain, continuously, indefinitely, with no margin for error and no good options if something went wrong. The feasibility tests began in 1958 with B-36 bombers, transitioning to B-52s by 1959. The early results were promising enough that SAC continued to expand the program. By 1960 and 1961, the concept had been formalized into what was officially named Operation Chrome Dome. Under LeMay's successor as SAC commander, General Thomas S. Power, Chrome Dome was officially announced publicly in January 1961. Power announced it publicly and without apology. SAC had nuclear-armed bombers in the air at all times. The Soviets should know this. That was the whole point. Deterrence only works if the other side believes in your capability and your will to use it. So Power told them, there are nuclear bombs in the sky over your approaches right now. There will be tomorrow. There will be forever. We are ready. Are you? In its main operational phase from 1961 to 1968, Operation Chrome Dome maintained 12 B-52 sorties per day following 3 basic routes. The northern route went up through Canada and over the Arctic toward the Soviet Union's northern approaches. A second route went east over the Atlantic and Mediterranean toward Europe. A third route went north from the United States into the Canadian Arctic. Each mission lasted approximately 24 hours. Each B-52 required at least 2 aerial refueling operations during its mission, carried out by KC-1 135 Stratotanker aircraft. Each refueling transferred approximately 12,500 gallons of fuel to the B-52 per operation. The KC-135 fleet made Chrome Dome possible, threading their fuel hoses through the sky in the dark, in bad weather, over the Arctic, over the ocean, keeping the bombers flying hour after hour after hour. Think about what this required in human terms. The B-52 crews were typically 6 men, an aircraft commander, a co-pilot, a radar navigator, an electronic warfare officer, and a gunner. These men flew 24-hour missions sitting in a pressurized aluminum tube at high altitude over some of the most hostile terrain and ocean on Earth, carrying weapons capable of destroying cities, waiting for orders that they deeply hoped would never come. One aircraft commander from this era, Major Adalbert Gionet, told Time magazine that he never flew without a toothbrush, mouthwash, a surgical needle, catgut, and a flask of whiskey. "If I ever rip any of me," he explained, "I want to be able to put myself together." That sentence tells you more about the psychological reality of Chrome Dome than any official history ever could. These men were living, for 24 hours at a stretch, inside the ultimate weapon, knowing that a single miscommunication, a single equipment failure, a single wrong decision could trigger a catastrophe beyond human imagination. The ground crew situation was equally demanding. At American air bases across the country and at overseas bases in Britain, Spain, and elsewhere, maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the Chrome Dome aircraft serviceable. Less than half the normal complement of ground crew supported the AVG squadrons in the earlier era of the Flying Tigers. The Chrome Dome crews similarly worked in conditions that were often exhausting and under-resourced, cannibalizing parts from grounded aircraft to keep the flying ones in the air, working through the night in hangars or on flight lines in weather that ranged from brutal New England winters to the baking heat of bases in the American South. During one single month of continuous Chrome Dome operations, SAC B-52s flew 2,088 sorties, totaling 47,168 hours of flying time, with a 97% effectiveness rate. Read that again. 2,088 sorties, 47,000 hours. In a single month. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nuclear weapons in the sky. The moment that truly tested Chrome Dome and demonstrated its strategic value came in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days in October 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union came as close to nuclear war as they have ever come in history. Soviet nuclear missiles had been discovered in Cuba, 90 miles from the American coast. President Kennedy had ordered a naval blockade. Khrushchev was threatening. The world held its breath. And in that moment, Curtis LeMay, now serving as Air Force Chief of Staff, pushed hard for airstrikes on Cuba and a maximum military response. At a meeting with Kennedy, LeMay told the president that the Soviet response to a blockade would be that there would be no reaction at all. Kennedy looked at him and said, "I think he'll have to do something." LeMay disagreed. LeMay thought American strength and willingness to use force was the only language the Soviets respected. The two men could barely stand to be in the same room together. Kennedy thought LeMay was a dangerous warmonger. LeMay thought Kennedy was dangerously weak. History suggests that Kennedy's approach was right. But LeMay's aggressive reading of Soviet psychology was also not entirely wrong, because Khrushchev was watching, very carefully, exactly what America was willing to do. On October 22, 1962, SAC Commander General Power ordered the airborne alert immediately doubled. Within hours, 66 B-52s were airborne daily, 28 on the northern route, 36 on the southern route, all of them armed, all of them at their stations. SAC also went to DEFCON 2 for the first and only time in Cold War history. DEFCON 2 means maximum readiness for war. It means the weapons are armed and waiting. It means the gap between peace and apocalypse has narrowed to almost nothing. Power sent his orders to division and wing commanders in non-coded form, meaning the Soviets read them almost immediately. That may have been deliberate. Khrushchev later wrote, with evident respect, that about 20% of all strategic air command planes, carrying atomic and hydrogen bombs, were kept aloft around the clock during the crisis. He respected it. He understood what it meant. And for whatever combination of reasons, the crisis ended without nuclear war. The missiles came out of Cuba. The bombers came down from DEFCON 2. The world exhaled. But here is the thing about Chrome Dome that the official histories and the Cold War deterrence theorists tend to underemphasize. The same quality that made Chrome Dome strategically brilliant, keeping nuclear-armed bombers continuously in the air, also made it continuously, inherently, agonizingly dangerous. Because aircraft crash, engines fail, crews make mistakes, equipment malfunctions, weather deteriorates, and when a B-52 crashes, and it is carrying 4 thermonuclear hydrogen bombs, the consequences are not like any other aircraft accident in history. The United States Air Force had a specific code word for accidents involving nuclear weapons. They called it a broken arrow. And during the years of Chrome Dome and the broader nuclear alert posture that preceded it, there were broken arrows. More than you probably know. More than most Americans have ever been told. The very first serious nuclear weapons accident occurred in February 1950, before Chrome Dome even began, when a B-36 jettisoned a nuclear weapon over the Pacific near British Columbia during an emergency. The weapon contained no plutonium at the time, so a nuclear detonation was impossible, but it set the pattern for what was coming. By 1958, the pace of nuclear accidents was accelerating with the pace of operations. In February of that year, a B-47 jettisoned a nuclear weapon into Wassaw Sound off the Georgia coast after a mid-air collision. Search crews looked for 2 months. They found nothing. That weapon is presumably still there. In March 1958, a B-47 accidentally released an unarmed nuclear bomb near Florence, South Carolina. The bomb's conventional explosives detonated on impact, blowing a crater in a residential area and injuring several people. The nuclear core was recovered. In November 1958, a B-47 crashed on takeoff from Dyess Air Force Base in Texas, leaving a crater 35 feet wide. The nuclear weapon aboard was destroyed in the resulting fire. The Air Force tallied 25 nuclear weapons accidents from February 1950 through January 1968. 25 nuclear weapons accidents in 18 years. Think about that number. 25 times that something went wrong with an American aircraft carrying a nuclear weapon. And the Air Force was absolutely not publicizing these events. The public knew almost nothing. The doctrine of nuclear deterrence required a certain level of public confidence in the safety and control of nuclear weapons, and every broken arrow threatened that confidence. So the accidents were quietly classified, quietly investigated, quietly reported to Congress behind closed doors, and quietly not mentioned to the American people who lived downwind of the crash sites and the contaminated fields and the ocean floors where lost weapons rested. The accidents did not stop Chrome Dome. If anything, the program continued to expand through the early 1960s. But then came January 24, 1961, just 3 days after President Kennedy's inauguration. A B-52 carrying 2 Mark 39 nuclear weapons crashed near Goldsboro, North Carolina, after a fuel leak caused the aircraft to break apart in midair. 6 of the 8 crew members survived by ejecting. The 2 hydrogen bombs separated from the aircraft and fell toward the ground. One of them deployed its parachute and landed relatively gently in a field. Recovery crews found it with 4 of its 5 safety arming switches in the armed position. 4 of 5. One switch, one single safety mechanism, stood between that bomb and a nuclear detonation over North Carolina. The other bomb came down without its parachute and impacted the soft, muddy ground at terminal velocity, driving itself deep into the earth. Recovery crews excavated the crash site, but could not recover all of it. Part of that bomb is still in the ground near Goldsboro, North Carolina, to this day. The Air Force purchased an easement on the land to prevent digging. 4 of 5 arming switches on. One switch between a thermonuclear detonation and a major American city. That story was not widely known for decades. When it finally came out, the implications were staggering. The safety systems on American nuclear weapons in the early 1960s were not as robust as the public had been assured. The doctrine of nuclear deterrence assumed that the weapons would never detonate accidentally. The Goldsboro incident demonstrated that this assumption was far less comfortable than anyone had publicly admitted. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, later acknowledged that the United States came close to detonating a nuclear weapon over its own territory. McNamara was a man who dealt in systems and statistics and rational analysis, and his analysis of the Goldsboro incident deeply shook his confidence in the entire nuclear alert posture. But Chrome Dome continued, and on January 17, 1966, it produced the most internationally visible and diplomatically damaging broken arrow of the Cold War. A B-52G Stratofortress, call sign Hobo 28, took off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. It was flying the southern Chrome Dome route, east across the Atlantic and over the Mediterranean, carrying 4 B-28 thermonuclear hydrogen bombs, each with a yield of approximately 1.1 megatons. To put that in perspective, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima had a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. A 1.1 megaton weapon is roughly 73 times more powerful than Hiroshima. This B-52 was carrying 4 of them. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, at 31,000 feet over the Mediterranean coast of Spain, Hobo 28 approached a KC-135 tanker from Moron Air Base in Spain for its second aerial refueling of the mission. The approach speed was slightly too fast. The connection failed. The tanker's refueling boom struck the B-52, ripping open the bomber along its spine. The KC-135 exploded instantly when its full fuel load ignited, killing all 4 crew members. The B-52 broke apart. 3 of its 7 crew members were killed. The other 4 ejected and parachuted to safety, and 4 thermonuclear hydrogen bombs fell out of the sky toward the Spanish coast. The tiny village of Palomares, a farming community of about 2,000 people known for growing the finest tomatoes in Spain, looked up and saw a ball of fire streaking toward them as 2 enormous aircraft disintegrated overhead. They watched pieces of wreckage, some the size of houses and some the size of coffee tables, rain down across their fields and their streets and their schoolyard. And somewhere in all of that wreckage were 4 hydrogen bombs. 1 bomb deployed its parachute as designed and landed gently in a sandbank near the beach, intact and recoverable. 2 bombs hit the ground hard. They're conventional explosives, the non-nuclear triggering charges that surround the plutonium core, detonated on impact. No nuclear explosion, but the detonations blew apart the plutonium cores of those weapons and scattered radioactive material across the fields and houses of Palomares. Approximately 2 square kilometers of Spanish soil were contaminated with plutonium. The 4th bomb came down in the Mediterranean Sea and was not found for 80 days, in the course of what was described at the time as the most expensive, intensive, and harrowing underwater search for a man-made object in human history. The cleanup of Palomares required 1,400 tons of contaminated soil and vegetation to be removed from Spain and shipped to storage facilities in the United States. It required hundreds of American military personnel to work for months on the site. Some of those personnel, young healthy men who handled the contaminated soil and debris, later developed unusual cancers. Of 40 veterans who participated in the cleanup, 21 developed cancer and 9 died from it. Spain banned American flights carrying nuclear weapons over its territory. The diplomatic fallout spread across NATO. Other countries hosting American military forces began reviewing their policies on nuclear overflights. The Palomares incident changed the politics of nuclear deterrence in Europe forever, and still Chrome Dome continued. Until the morning of January 21, 1968, when a B-52 flying a Chrome Dome orbit near Thule Air Base in Greenland, on the northern route designed to monitor the ballistic missile early warning radar installation there, crashed onto the ice after a fire broke out in the navigation compartment. The crew attempted to land the aircraft at Thule, but could not. One crew member died. The other 6 survived by ejecting. The B-52 slid burning across the sea ice of North Star Bay at high speed and disintegrated. Its 4 hydrogen bombs did not cause a nuclear detonation, but their conventional explosives detonated, scattering radioactive plutonium across approximately 7.5 square kilometers of Greenland ice and into the waters of Bylot Sound below. The cleanup required hundreds of Danish and American workers operating in Arctic conditions. Greenland is Danish territory. Denmark had a declared nuclear-free zone policy. The Thule base existed under a 1951 defense agreement that had never explicitly addressed the question of nuclear weapons being stored or flown over Danish territory. The diplomatic crisis that followed the Thule accident was severe. And this time, 2 days after the Thule crash, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered it stopped. The airborne nuclear alert, the continuous flying of nuclear-armed B-52s that had been going on in various forms for years, was terminated. Chrome Dome was over. The Joint Chiefs of Staff formally directed SAC to cease airborne nuclear missions. After January 22, 1968, America's nuclear deterrence would rest on land-based missiles in their hardened silos and submarine-launched ballistic missiles in the depths of the ocean, weapons that could not crash, could not burn, could not scatter plutonium across the countryside of Allied nations. The bombers would remain part of the nuclear triad, but they would no longer fly continuously armed with live weapons. The decision to end Chrome Dome also reflected a broader evolution in nuclear strategy that had been underway for years. By the mid-1960s, the United States had deployed thousands of Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles in hardened underground silos scattered across the American Midwest. These missiles could survive a Soviet first strike. They required no crew to be airborne and at risk. They could be launched within minutes of receiving the order. They did not require aerial refueling or maintenance between missions or crews who had to spend 24 hours breathing recycled air at high altitude. From a pure deterrence standpoint, the ICBMs solved the vulnerability problem that Chrome Dome had been designed to address. If the Soviets could not destroy your missiles before they were launched, and hardened silos made that extremely difficult, then you had a guaranteed second strike capability without ever having to keep a single aircraft in the air. Curtis LeMay himself was not an enthusiast of ICBMs. He famously called ballistic missiles toys. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had spent his entire career in aircraft, that the manned bomber was irreplaceable. A missile, once launched, cannot be recalled. A bomber can. A missile cannot be retargeted in flight. A bomber can. A missile cannot assess the damage it has done and adjust accordingly. A bomber can. LeMay's argument for the manned bomber was not irrational. It was actually quite sophisticated. The problem was that it required keeping men in the air with nuclear weapons indefinitely, and Palomares and Thule had demonstrated where that led. LeMay left the Air Force in February 1965, retiring after a career that had made him one of the most consequential and controversial military figures of the 20th century. His legacy is extraordinarily difficult to assess cleanly. On one hand, he built SAC from a hollow shell into a genuinely formidable force that almost certainly deterred Soviet aggression throughout the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. The peace that LeMay helped maintain, however uncomfortable and precarious, was real. Western Europe was not conquered by Soviet forces. The United States was not struck by Soviet nuclear weapons. The deterrent worked, in the sense that the war it was designed to prevent did not happen. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. On the other hand, the methods LeMay used, and the risks he was willing to accept in service of that deterrence, were genuinely terrifying. 25 nuclear weapons accidents. A bomb with 4 of 5 arming switches activated sitting in a field in North Carolina. For hydrogen bombs scattered across Spanish farmland. Plutonium in the waters of Baffin Bay. Lost weapons on the floor of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. These were not hypothetical risks. They were real events. They happened. And in each case, the gap between a manageable incident and a genuine nuclear detonation was smaller than the American public ever knew. Robert McNamara, who understood nuclear strategy as well as anyone alive, later said that America's survival of the Cold War without nuclear war was partly due to skill and partly due to luck. That is a remarkable thing for the architect of American nuclear strategy to admit. That luck was involved. That it could have gone differently. After retiring, LeMay entered politics in one of the strangest and most uncomfortable episodes of his remarkable life. He agreed to serve as the vice presidential running mate of Alabama Governor George Wallace on the American Independent Party ticket in the 1968 presidential election. Wallace was running on a platform of segregation and resistance to the civil rights movement. LeMay was a military man with almost no political instincts, and his presence on the ticket was an awkward fit from the beginning. At a press conference, when asked about the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam, LeMay gave an answer that was honest in the way that everything he did was honest, but catastrophically damaging politically. He said, essentially, that nuclear weapons were just a bigger bomb, and that the threshold for their use should not be as high as politicians were treating it. The Wallace campaign was horrified. The press had a field day. LeMay became a liability rather than an asset. The Wallace-LeMay ticket still managed to win 5 states and 13.5% of the national popular vote, which is a remarkable result for a third-party presidential campaign. But LeMay never held elected office, and perhaps that was just as well. Curtis LeMay died on October 1, 1990, the year after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the question that Chrome Dome leaves us with, the question that LeMay's entire career leaves us with, is one that has no clean answer and probably never will. Was the deterrence worth the risk? Were the broken arrows, the lost bombs, the contaminated Spanish farmland, the plutonium in the Greenland ice, the bombs sitting in the ground in North Carolina to this day, were all of these the acceptable price of a Cold War that never became hot? Or did the risks that SAC took, the continuous parade of nuclear weapons through the sky over inhabited terrain, over allied nations, over oceans that could swallow hydrogen bombs and never give them back, actually bring us closer to the catastrophe that the deterrence was designed to prevent? Was Curtis LeMay, with his cigar and his absolute certainty and his brilliant, brutal strategic mind, a man who saved the world? Or was he a man who kept civilization teetering on the edge of an abyss for 3 decades and called it professionalism? The Strategic Air Command. Chrome Dome. Peace is our profession. This is the story of how America kept the nuclear peace, and how close it came, more times than you know, to something very different. Now here is the question I want you to think about and answer in the comments below. If you were the President of the United States during the Cold War, knowing everything you know now about the nuclear accidents that occurred during Chrome Dome, about the near detonation over North Carolina, about the lost hydrogen bomb in the Mediterranean, would you have ordered Chrome Dome to continue? Was the deterrence worth the risk? Or was there a better way to keep the peace? Let me know what you think down below. And if you found this story as extraordinary as I did, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to know this history.